I don't think they should assume that because they believe in the righteousness of their argument, that is enough. The deference that people have towards the so-called expert has gone. We live in a far more raw and rough democratic world when it comes to ideas. And if you want to win an argument, you have to be prepared to engage positively and openly with people who, frankly, think that what you might be saying is extremely subjective. So don't assume that you're objective. Don't assume that what you're saying is going to be accepted by other people. Be prepared to argue your case.
And how can they do that? Is it simply a case of getting out there and opening a Twitter account, or going on Facebook and sending you a message, or sending someone else a message? How can you really interact with the people that matter? Because you say the experts perhaps aren't as respected as they once were, but ultimately it still comes down to people like you who are going to be making decisions.
Well, my old university, the University of East Anglia, I think they learnt, or rather they showed the rest of us the hard way, what happens when you leave it to an elite who believe in the righteousness of their cause. Rather than simply asserting that you know what's best, I think you have to be prepared to engage with people in a way that they can understand. And no one is too high and mighty. No one's too much of an expert not to engage with people who know very little of the science. Some of the most effective arguments put forward, I think, have been put forward by people very sceptical about the idea of man-made climate change, precisely because they're willing to engage with people at their level.
And that's, for people listening in Doha, that's the one of the MP's bells to mean you have to go for tea or go for watch the session. Interesting aspect of your book, I thought, was the idea that you said there's no, I can't remember the exact quote, so you can remind me, but the dogma is, there's no space for dogma anymore. That's blown away. But in this world of the internet, where everyone has their own blog, surely actually what we're seeing is a reinforcing of dogma. Everyone has their own small circle of followers. Everyone sort of sends them tweets. Everyone sends them comments. Aren't we actually seeing, with the democratization of the internet and expansion of the internet, more dogma, not less?
Well, I think if you engage with Twitter and blogs in a very opinionated way, you might have a sort of cult following, but it'll be a very small cult. The wonderful thing about Twitter and the blogs, and I tweet a lot and I blog a lot myself, the wonderful thing about them is that actually, you rely on the judgment of a lot of people, the wisdom of a very large crowd, in order to have credibility. Before we had digital technology, in order for a person to have their voice heard, they basically had to schmooze up to and ingratiate themselves with a newspaper editor or a producer. And if you were accepted by them, you could shout through the media to millions of people. Mm-hmm. Because of the internet, you now have to rely on the judgment of in a sense, you have to be filtered by the views of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. So, you still have quality control, but it's a very different type of quality control. Comments become much more democratized, and if you want to engage in comment, and if you want to win the argument, you have to be prepared to be much more democratic in your outlook and your attitudes. There's very little room for zealotry. You've got to be prepared to engage with people who, frankly, are sceptical. And you've also got to understand scepticism is a good thing. And if people are being sceptical about your claims, it's your problem, not theirs.
And in terms of reaching out to people like you and other politicians, what do you find is the most effective way that youth activists, whatever their beliefs, whatever they're going for, what's the most effective way to catch your attention and make you think, right, I'll ask a question about this, or I will, raise this with one of my colleagues?
The absolute key is authenticity. If you're tweeting or blogging, you've got to actually be authentic. You've got to believe what you say, and you've got to say what you believe. Tweeting, for example, just if it's not the actual person doing their own tweets, if they don't actually believe in what they're saying, it just doesn't ring true, it just doesn't sound authentic. So you've got to be authentic. I think a key thing, though, is to have a little bit of self-doubt. Mm-hmm. I find that actually some of the most interesting interactions I have with people online about a whole range of subjects are areas where I say that, I'm a little bit sceptical and a little bit doubtful, and I don't have absolute certainty. And then I find actually some people who I would expect to have very different views from me actually sort of meeting me halfway. And some of the most interesting engagements I've had with people online have actually been precisely because I've been a little bit less certain and a little bit less strident. And I think if you do that online, you get a great conversation, a great dialogue. You win people over.
Quickly going back to your point about experts, if we are going to stop trusting in experts, where does that leave us? Because if I'm going to a hospital and someone tells me I've got a bad knee, this is what you need to do, I might go and get a second opinion and a third opinion. How many opinions do I need to get?
Well, if I got on an aeroplane, I hope the guy flying it was an expert. If a pilot, male or female, wasn't an expert, I wouldn't want to be on board. Experts are good. The problem, though, is excessive deference to people who claim to be experts. Just a lot of the public policy decisions that are made, particularly in Western countries now, are made by people, by technocrats, by so-called experts. Actually, if you look at some of the decisions that they've made, and I can give you a whole stack of examples, actually they may have had a specialised knowledge, but their judgment was pretty profoundly flawed. And I think what we need to recognise is that the people with a vested interest in a particular public policy outcome might call themselves experts, but in broad social terms, I'm not sure leaving it to them to make the judgments is the right thing. Crowdsourcing judgment. If someone's an expert and their judgment is so good, then they'll have no problem in having ordinary folk stress test it and challenge it. And if they can't do that, then they're probably not much of an expert.
Although, if I'm trying to think of one of those ancient Greek philosophers who may have said that the Earth was round, and they probably got shouted down. Two more quick questions. The first is, you talk a lot about markets in your book. Is approaching business, is interacting with business, is consumer demand going to be a more effective way of changing policy in the future than it is now?
If I could pick up the point you made about flat earthism, I seem to remember that it was an elite, the Catholic Church, who insisted for many years about the nature of the universe. In fact, they burnt a couple of radical monks who disagreed. If you go to a lot of coastal communities amongst folk who sailed ships, I think they well understood that the Earth was curved long before the elites were willing to accept it. So I slightly take issue with your point. So your second question?
Second question about influencing demand. You talk a lot about the markets. Is that a more effective way of influencing policy? Do you see that sort of becoming more effective in terms of, what people buy, what they decide to buy, how they make their decisions?
Sorry, I don't.
Well, in terms of, for instance, if there is a concern that a certain company is using paper from an endangered forest in whatever country, and there's a boycott, is that an effective way?
I think one of the great things about the digital revolution is it's going to give consumer pressure and consumer activism a whole new lease of life. Companies have a vested interest in selling stuff. If the people who buy that stuff can start to group together and say, do you know what, we don't find this behaviour acceptable, we want change, it can be an incredibly powerful tool. You've only got to get a relatively small percentage of your market boycotting your products to force you to change things. Now, consumer boycotts have long been a tool, but I think digital technology allows people to come together, it aggregates opinion, and it could allow consumer boycotts to be much, much more effective. We're beginning to see it taking on some of the big banks in this country, and it's a wonderful tool. Mm-hmm. I do think we can see this sort of citizen power, consumer citizen power, used constructively to make sure that companies behave ethically. I think it's I'm a free market capitalist, but I think it's wonderful to see the consumer coming together and saying, do you know what, if you don't change your ethical behaviour, if you don't change the way you source products, we're not going to buy from you. That's wonderful. That's exactly what should happen in a free market.
Okay, final point. I think this is a good opportunity for the people maybe watching in Doha to get an idea about why people disagree with what they're campaigning for. What is it about the climate change debate or the science that you disagree with and has made you feel I'm not entirely comfortable with the current policies we're adopting.
I was a member of Friends of the Earth long before I ever joined the Conservative Party, and when I joined Friends of the Earth in the mid-1980s, I had a poster on my wall that explained the greenhouse gas effect, we used to call it then. And so, I once shared the view that mankind was largely responsible for changing the climate. I'm much more sceptical about that now, and that's mainly because I read a book by Ian Plimer, or Plimer, some people call him, and it's a much more complicated argument than we used to think. In a sense, the climate has always changed, and the climate always will change, and there are many factors that influence the way that the Earth's climate. I think people who fear the impact of humankind on the climate have perhaps overstated the impact of mankind. Many religions throughout history have put mankind at the centre of creation, have overstated his power, and have suggested that if we take a particular road to virtue, we will find redemption. I see some uncomfortable parallels between some of the climate change zealots. I'm in favour of environmental protection, and there are lots of things that we really do need to do to preserve the environment. The invasion of alien species, for example, is a huge area, and we've not really done enough. But when it comes to the narrow issue of climate change, I'm doubtful that mankind is largely responsible for the changes. And I think there are other things we could do much more productively to preserve the environment.
That's probably the Prime Minister. We'll leave it there.